After 41 years of marriage, he left her penniless. But in his meticulous, cruel accounting of their shared life, he forgot the one thing that was never his to begin with: the small, dilapidated cabin her grandmother had left her, a place he'd always called a worthless pile of sticks. What he didn't know, and what she was about to discover, was that a pile of sticks can be the strongest foundation of all. If you've ever been underestimated, or had to start over when you thought the story was already when we have nothing left to lose. The lawyer's office was the color of forgetting. Beige walls, beige carpet, a beige pot holding a plastic plant that would never grow and would never die. It was a room designed to neutralize emotion, to render grief and fury into manageable, billable hours. Ms. Chen, a woman half my age, with eyes that were somehow both kind and completely unreadable, slid a single sheet of paper across the polished surface of the desk. It wasn't a long letter. Richard had never been a man for sentiment. His cruelty was efficient. He liquidated the joint savings and investment accounts 2 months ago, Eleanor, Ms. Chen said, her voice a soft, steady instrument of devastation. He then used a power of attorney you signed back in 2015, for his heart surgery, you'll recall, to remortgage the house to its maximum value. The funds were wired to an offshore account. The house is in foreclosure. The creditors have already begun proceedings. I stared at the paper. It was just a summary, a neat column of figures with parentheses around them, like little sad mouths. 41 years, summarized in brackets. 41 years of packing his lunches, of raising our 2 children, who are now grown and gone with their own lives, of rubbing his feet after a long day, of believing we were a we. All of it, gone, drained, siphoned away into an account in a country I couldn't even find on a map. I felt nothing. It was a strange, hollow sensation, like I was watching a movie about some other poor, foolish woman. The woman on the screen was numb, her hands resting in her lap, her sensible shoes flat on the floor. She looked tired. The cars? I heard myself ask. My voice was thin, a stranger's voice. Both were leased. The company repossessed them this morning. The credit cards, I'm afraid, are maxed out, and they are in your name as well as his. Of course they were. I remembered the day he'd added my name. He'd said it was for protection, in case something happened to him. A thoughtful gesture. That was Richard. Always thoughtful, right up until the moment he gutted you. A quiet, methodical demolition. He hadn't even had the decency to be loud about it. No shouting match, no dramatic exit, just a note on the kitchen counter next to the coffee maker. I've gone. Don't look for me. I'd thought he meant he'd gone to the hardware store. I'd waited 2 days before the cold dread began to seep in. So there is nothing, I said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, as plain as the beige walls around me. Ms. Chen steepled her fingers. It was a lawyerly gesture, one I was sure they taught in a class called How to Look Calm While Delivering Life-Shattering News. Financially, from the marital assets, that is correct. Richard was thorough. Thorough. That was a word for it. Malignant was another. Predatory. I thought of the last time I saw him. He'd kissed my cheek, told me he was going on a fishing trip with some old colleagues. He'd even packed his tackle box. I'd waved from the doorway of our beautiful, mortgaged-to-the-hilt home. A home I now understood I had merely been housekeeping for a thief. The sheer premeditation of it all was what took my breath away. This wasn't a sudden affair, a midlife crisis. This was a long con. My life had been a long con. I looked down at my hands. They were my mother's hands, now. The knuckles were a little swollen, the veins more pronounced. These hands had changed thousands of diapers, cooked thousands of meals, held his hand through illnesses and job losses. They had gardened and painted and scrubbed and soothed. They were good hands, and now they were empty. However, Ms. Chen said, leaning forward slightly, The shift in posture was so minute it was almost imperceptible, but in that sterile room, it felt like a seismic event. She reached into a different folder, a thinner one, made of worn, faded cardboard. There is one asset that was not marital, an inheritance. Something passed directly to you, and only you, years before the bulk of your shared assets were accumulated. She slid a different document across the table. It was a deed, old, typed on a machine that punched the letters into the thick, fibrous paper. The ink was faded to a soft gray. At the top, in elegant, spidery script, was my grandmother's name, Clara May Thompson. At the bottom, in the same script, was mine, Eleanor Vance. "The cabin," I whispered. "The cabin," Ms. Chen confirmed. 1.5 acres of land and a structure in Blackwood County. Your grandmother's will was ironclad. It passed from her to you with the stipulation that it could never be used as collateral or co-signed to a spouse. It was yours alone. It appears, in his very thorough accounting, Mr. Vance either forgot about it or, more likely, dismissed it as worthless. Worthless. A pile of sticks. I hadn't been there in 30 years. Richard hated it. No electricity, no plumbing, too many bugs, too far from a decent restaurant. Every excuse was a wall he built around me, separating me from that part of my past. From her, my grandmother Clara. I could see her face, clear as day, her sharp blue eyes and the web of laughter lines around them, the smell of wood smoke and chamomile tea that always clung to her sweaters. She had been the anchor of my childhood, a bastion of fierce, unconditional love. She died when I was 22, a year after I married Richard. She'd met him only twice. She never said she disliked him. She didn't have to. Clara had a way of being silent that was louder than most people's shouting. I looked at the deed in my hands. It was more than paper. It was a lifeline. A thin, brittle thread thrown across a chasm of 41 years. I had no money, no home, no husband. But I had a pile of sticks on a forgotten patch of dirt. And for the first time in that beige, airless room, I felt the tiniest flicker of something. It wasn't hope. It was more primal than that. It was a choice. I could crumble, or I could go to the one place that had only ever been mine. The decision wasn't really a decision at all. It was an inevitability, the only logical step when every other path has been dynamited behind you. I went back to the house, his house, the bank's house, and walked through the rooms that suddenly felt like a stranger's. The indentation on his side of the bed, the coffee cup he preferred, sitting clean in the dish rack. Each object was a tiny betrayal, a piece of a life that had been a lie. I had spent 4 decades building a home, and it turned out I had just been curating a museum of my own deception. I packed a single suitcase. What do you take with you when your life has been stripped for parts? I took my mother's wedding ring, which I wore on my right hand. I took 3 sweaters, a few pairs of sturdy pants, my warmest boots. I took the photo album from before I was married, the one filled with pictures of me and my parents, of summers spent with Clara at the cabin. The girl in those photos looked fearless. I didn't recognize her. Lastly, I packed a thick wool blanket and every bit of non-perishable food from the pantry. A few cans of beans, a bag of rice, a jar of peanut butter. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Leaving the house was the hardest and easiest thing I had ever done. I didn't look back. I closed the door on 41 years of ghosts and walked to the bus station downtown, my suitcase bumping along behind me like a loyal, weary dog. The bus ride was 6 hours long, a slow, rattling transition from the curated suburbs to the untamed wilderness of the state's northern counties. The landscape changed in increments. Manicured lawns gave way to sprawling farms, which then gave way to dense, tangled forests of pine and birch. The farther we went, the more the air outside the grimy window seemed to clean itself. I watched the neat, orderly world I had known dissolve into something wilder, something more honest. I pressed my forehead against the cool glass, the vibration of the engine a steady, monotonous hum. For the first time in weeks, the roaring in my own head began to quiet. I wasn't running away from something. I was running toward the only thing I had left. The bus let me off at a crossroads with a single, blinking yellow light. There was a gas station and a diner with a sign that said, "Eat." That was it. The town of Blackwood was another 2 miles down the road, but the cabin was in the other direction, nestled deep in the woods that bordered the state park. The air hit me first. It was cold, sharp, and smelled of damp earth and pine needles. It was the smell of my childhood. The sun was low in the sky, casting long, skeletal shadows across the road. I adjusted the strap of my bag on my shoulder and started walking. The silence was profound, broken only by the crunch of my boots on the gravel shoulder and the distant caw of a crow. This was it. No turning back. The path to the cabin wasn't a path anymore. It was a suggestion, a memory of a trail now almost completely reclaimed by ferns and saplings. I had to push my way through, branches snagging at my coat. I remembered running down this path as a girl, my grandmother calling after me to watch for snakes. And then I saw it. The cabin was smaller than I remembered, hunkered down under the heavy arms of ancient pine trees. The roof sagged a little in the middle, like a tired old man taking a breath. The porch steps were covered in a slick green moss, and a shutter hung crooked from one of the front windows. It was neglected, forgotten, beaten down by 30 winters. And it was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. I set down my suitcase and reached into my pocket for the key. It was the original skeleton key, cold and heavy in my palm. Clara had given it to me the day I left for college. "You always have a place to come home to, Eleanor," she'd said. "Don't you ever forget that." I had forgotten. For 41 years, I had forgotten. The key slid into the lock with a grating sound. It took some jiggling, a bit of force, but finally, with a loud, protesting clunk, the lock turned. I pushed the door open. It swung inward on a single, groaning hinge, opening into a wall of darkness that smelled of dust, cold stone, and time itself. I took a step inside, into the gloom, into the only home I had left in the world. The air inside was thick and still, a perfect preservation of the last time the door was closed. Dust motes danced like tiny fairies in the single beam of light slanting from the open doorway. The main room was just as I remembered it, only shrouded in white sheets, making the furniture look like a gathering of ghosts. There was the big stone fireplace that dominated the far wall, the hearth cold and black. The sturdy oak table where my grandmother and I would play cards, its surface hidden. The 2 rocking chairs angled toward the hearth, waiting for a conversation that had ended decades ago. I walked to the nearest window and struggled with the latch. It was swollen with damp, but I forced it open. Cool, fresh air flooded the room, stirring the dust and disturbing the perfect stillness. I went around the room, opening the other windows, letting the late afternoon light pour in. Then I started pulling off the sheets. I folded each one carefully, the puff of dust making me sneeze. There was the worn floral sofa, the armchair with the patch on the arm where Grandpa Joe had spilled pipe ash. There was the bookshelf, still packed with Clara's books, dog-eared paperbacks, field guides to birds and mushrooms, thick historical novels. Running my fingers along their spines was like shaking hands with old friends. This wasn't just a cabin. It was a museum of a life well lived, a life of substance. Unlike the home I had just left. In the small kitchenette, I found a stack of tin plates and a pump handle next to the dry sink. I remembered the rhythm of it, the squeak and groan, and then the gush of icy, sweet well water. I pumped the handle. For a long moment, nothing happened but a dry, asthmatic wheeze. I kept pumping, putting my whole body into it, my muscles protesting. It felt like I was trying to restart a stopped heart. And then, a sputtering cough, a trickle of rusty brown water, and finally, a clear, cold stream. I cupped my hands and drank. It was the best water I had ever tasted. I spent the rest of the daylight hours in a frenzy of activity. I swept the floors, clouds of dust billowing out the open door. I wiped down the surfaces with a rag dipped in well water. I found a stack of firewood in a covered box on the porch, dry and seasoned, left there by my grandmother as one last act of care for a future she would never see. I laid a fire in the hearth, just as she had taught me. The crumpled newspaper, the kindling teepee, the larger logs on top. It took me 2 matches, but the flame caught, licking the old wood, and a plume of smoke, for the first time in 30 years, curled up the chimney. As warmth began to bleed into the room, chasing the chill from the stone and wood, I felt a sense of ownership, of purpose, that I hadn't felt in years. This was real work. It had immediate, tangible results. You sweep a floor, it becomes clean. You build a fire, it gives warmth. My life with Richard had been the opposite. All my work had vanished, leaving nothing behind. As darkness fell outside, I sat in one of the rocking chairs, the firelight dancing on the walls. The cabin was still rustic, still rough, but it was alive again. It was breathing with me. It was in that quiet moment, staring into the flames, that I felt the first real pang of grief. Not for Richard, not for the life I'd lost, but for my grandmother. A deep, aching sorrow for the woman who had loved me so fiercely, whose protection had reached across time to catch me when I fell. My gaze drifted to the small bedroom off the main room. Her bedroom. I hadn't gone in there yet. I stood up and walked to the door, my hand hesitating on the simple wooden latch. I pushed it open. The room was Spartan. A single, iron-frame bed, a small wooden dresser, a braided rug on the floor. The air in here was even more still, more personal. It smelled faintly of lavender, the way her clothes always did. The bed was neatly made, covered with one of her handmade quilts. I ran my hand over the intricate stitching. It was under the bed that I saw it, a dark, rectangular shape pushed far against the wall. It wasn't a shadow, it was a box, a heavy metal lockbox, the kind people used to keep important papers in. My heart gave a sudden hard thump against my ribs. I got down on my hands and knees on the cold wooden floor, the rough boards pressing into my skin, and reached under the bed. My fingers brushed against the cold, dusty metal. I dragged it out into the firelight. It was old, painted black, with a sturdy lock on the front. It was heavy, and it was locked tight. There was no key. I shook it, and something inside shifted with a soft, dense thud. It wasn't the rattle of papers. It was something heavier, something solid. For a long time, I just sat there on the floor, my hand resting on the cold metal of the box. The fire crackled, casting dancing shadows that made the small cabin feel both immense and intimate. The box was a solid, tangible mystery in a life that had become terrifyingly abstract. My money wasn't real. My house wasn't mine. My marriage had been a vapor. But this box was real. It was heavy. It was here. Finding a key seemed impossible. I searched the bedroom first, my fingers tracing the insides of the dresser drawers, feeling under the thin mattress, checking the pockets of the single dress still hanging in the small closet. Nothing. I moved to the main room, my search becoming more frantic. I ran my hands along the mantelpiece, peered inside the sugar bowl and flour tin in the kitchenette. It felt like Clara had set me a puzzle, and I was failing the first part. Defeated, I sank back into the rocking chair, staring at the box. It was a dead end. Another hope that turned into a locked door. My frustration began to curdle into despair. I was a fool. A 63-year-old woman with a can of beans and a locked box, sitting in a derelict cabin in the middle of nowhere. Richard was probably on a beach somewhere, drinking something with an umbrella in it. The thought sent a hot, bitter wave of anger through me. It was the anger that saved me. It was a fuel I hadn't realized I possessed. I wasn't my grandmother. I didn't have her patience or her quiet wisdom. I got up, went to the hearth, and picked up the iron poker. It was heavy and solid in my hand. If I couldn't find the key, I would make my own. I wedged the tip of the poker into the seam of the box, right next to the lock. I put my weight on it, grunting with the effort. The metal groaned, but didn't give. I repositioned it and tried again, my knuckles white, my whole body trembling with exertion and rage. This box would not beat me. This was the one thing Richard hadn't taken, and I would not be denied. With a final, desperate heave, the metal shrieked and the lid popped open with a sudden, violent crack. I dropped the poker with a clatter and knelt before the box, my heart hammering. I lifted the bent lid. Inside, there was no treasure. No gold coins or sparkling jewels. The first thing I saw was a stack of envelopes, tied together with a faded blue ribbon. They were addressed to me, in my grandmother's familiar, elegant handwriting. "For my Eleanor," the top one read. Beneath the letters was a small, velvet pouch. I opened it and tipped the contents into my palm. It was a key. A small, ornate brass key. I stared at it, then back at the broken lock on the box. A slow, dry laugh escaped my lips. Of course. Clara, you clever, clever woman. The key wasn't for the box. The box was to protect the key. And the letters. My hands trembled as I picked up the stack of envelopes. They were thick, heavy with pages. I untied the ribbon and looked at the first one. It wasn't dated. The paper was crisp, as if it had been written yesterday. I took a deep breath, the air smelling of wood smoke and revelation, and began to read. My dearest Eleanor, if you are reading this, it means two things. First, that you have come home to the cabin, which fills my old heart with a warmth I cannot describe. And second, that you have needed to. I pray I am wrong about this. I pray these letters are found by your grandchildren 100 years from now, a quaint curiosity from a long-gone ancestor. But my gut, which has rarely failed me, tells me that will not be the case. My gut tells me you are here because the man you married has finally shown his true colors. I had to stop. My eyes blurred, and I had to wipe them with the back of my hand. She had known. From the very beginning, she had known. I thought of her cool, polite distance with Richard. I had mistaken it for old-fashioned shyness. It had been an assessment, a verdict. I continued reading. I did not want to cloud your happiness, child. To see you in love was a great joy. But I was a fool once, too. I know what it is to be charmed by a handsome face and easy words, to overlook the flicker of greed in a man's eyes because you want so desperately to believe in the goodness you see. Your grandfather, Joe, was a good man, a simple man, but the man before him was not. He taught me that some men see a woman's love not as a gift to be cherished, but as a resource to be tapped. Richard has that look about him. He looks at you, but he sees a comfortable life. I saw it the day he looked at my wedding ring, the one I gave to your mother and she gave to you. He didn't see the history. He saw the weight of the gold. I saw it when he talked about his ambitions. His dreams were not of building a life, but of acquiring one. So I did the only thing I could. I made sure this place, this small patch of earth, would always be yours. A lifeboat. He cannot touch it. He cannot sell it. He cannot use it to pay his debts. It is an island, Eleanor. Your island. I put the letter down, my hands shaking too much to hold it steady. It was too much. The validation, the grief, the sheer, staggering foresight of her love. It was a love that didn't just nurture, it strategized, it planned. It saw the enemy at the gate 40 years before the siege began. I leaned forward and rested my forehead on the cool wood of the table, and for the first time since I'd read Richard's note, I cried. I cried for my own blindness. For the years I had defended him to my grandmother, assuring her he was a good man. I cried for the woman who had seen the truth and had to keep it to herself, choosing to protect me from the shadows rather than frighten me with them. And I cried for the profound, lonely strength it must have taken for her to write these letters, to plan for a disaster she prayed would never happen. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, and the cabin was growing cold again. But I didn't move. I just sat there in the dark, with the truth so heavy it felt like it had rearranged the atoms in the room. My grandmother hadn't just left me a cabin, she had left me a map, and I was just beginning to understand where it led. After a long time, I stirred myself. I added more logs to the fire, the flames flaring up with a hungry roar, pushing the darkness back into the corners. I made myself a cup of tea on the small camp stove I'd found, my hands cupped around the warm mug. My tears had been a release, a scouring of the numbness that had encased me for weeks. Now, my mind felt sharp, clear. I picked up the next letter. My Eleanor, do not waste your years on anger. It is a poison you drink hoping the other person will die. Richard is what he is, a hollow man. Hollow things are loud and shiny, but they have no core. You have a core, child. It was forged in these woods, in this very cabin. You learn to be quiet, to observe. You learn to tell the difference between a cardinal and a tanager, between the scent of rain and the scent of snow. You learn to be patient. These are not small things. They are the tools of survival. I want to tell you about this land. It is not just 1.5 acres. Your great-grandfather, my father, was a surveyor. He was a quiet, meticulous man who believed in owning the ground beneath his feet. When the big timber companies came through here in the 20s, they bought up thousands of acres for pennies. But they were careless. Their surveys were rushed. My father, in his quiet way, followed behind them. He found slivers of land they missed, oddly shaped parcels, forgotten corners. He filed claims on them, legally and properly. He never told anyone. He called it his rock garden. He said it was good to have a place no one else knew about. My breath caught in my throat. I read the lines again. Slivers of land they missed. When he passed, he left it all to me. Not just this cabin plot, but a dozen other small, disconnected parcels scattered throughout Blackwood County. They are not much on their own, a rocky cliffside here, a marshy patch there. Worthless, most would say, just like they'd say about this cabin. People have a poor imagination for what is worthless, but together, Eleanor, they add up. And one of them is not like the others. It is a 5-acre plot deep in the state park, a piece of land the park accidentally surrounded, but never absorbed. The old timber survey missed it, and the state survey that created the park missed it again. It is an island of private property in a sea of public land. And on that land, Eleanor, is a cave. Your great-grandfather found it when he was charting the area. He said the entrance was almost perfectly hidden behind a waterfall. My mind was reeling. This was more than a family story. This was a treasure map. The careful, almost paranoid secrecy, the quiet accumulation of forgotten things. It was a strategy passed down through generations. I have never told anyone about this. Not your grandfather, not your mother. Some things are for the women of this family to know. Some burdens and some strengths are ours to carry alone. In this box, with this letter, you will find a map, hand-drawn by my father. You will also find his surveyor's logbook. It contains the legal descriptions and deed numbers for every single parcel of his rock garden. These are not copies. They are the originals. The county clerk's office burned down in 1958. Their records are a mess. These papers in your hand are likely the only definitive proof of ownership that exists. I put the letter down and rummaged in the bottom of the lockbox. There it was, a slim, leather-bound book, its cover cracked with age, and rolled inside it a delicate, yellowed piece of drafting paper. I unrolled the map. It was a beautiful, intricate drawing of the county, covered in my great-grandfather's precise architectural script. Dozens of small, irregular shapes were shaded in, and one, set apart from the others, was circled in red ink. A note next to it read, "The Grotto." This was it. This was the core my grandmother had spoken of. It wasn't just resilience or character. It was tangible. It was land. It was secrets. It was power. A power Richard, with all his slick financial maneuvers, could never have conceived of. He dealt in numbers on a screen, in debts and leveraged assets. My family dealt in earth, in stone, in things you could hold in your hand. And then I read the final paragraph of her letter, the one that would change everything. I do not know what you will do with this knowledge, Eleanor. The money I have saved for you is not in a bank. Banks can be plundered, men can be compromised. It is in the grotto. It is your inheritance, your fresh start, your war chest. Whatever you need it to be. The key you found with these letters is for the second box, the one hidden there. But I want you to think carefully. You could take the money and disappear, build a new life somewhere quiet. No one would blame you. Or you could stay. You could fight. You could use these deeds, this land, this truth, to build something right here, on the foundation our family laid. The easy path is to run. The hard path is to put down roots. The choice, my dearest Eleanor, has always been yours. I leaned back in the chair, the letter resting in my lap. The firelight flickered across the hand-drawn map. My entire world had been demolished, and in the rubble, my grandmother had left me the blueprints for a fortress. The question was no longer what could I do. The question was, who did I want to be? The woman who ran or the woman who stayed? The next few hours passed in a blur of intense focus. I read and reread every letter, pored over the surveyor's logbook, and studied the intricate map. It was a crash course in my own history, a secret legacy I never knew I had. The scale of my family's quiet defiance was staggering. They hadn't been simple country people, they had been custodians of a hidden kingdom, disguised as a rock garden. The anger I had felt toward Richard began to transform. It was no longer a hot, consuming rage, but a cold, hard resolve. He had mistaken my kindness for weakness, my trust for naivety. He had underestimated me. He had underestimated my family. That was a mistake he was going to regret. As dawn broke, painting the eastern sky in shades of pale rose and gray, I knew what I had to do. There was no real choice. Running wasn't in my blood. My grandmother hadn't saved this legacy for me so I could cash it in and hide. She had saved it so I could stand on it. I found an old rucksack in a closet and began to pack. A canteen of water, the rest of the peanut butter, a compass I found in a drawer, a flashlight with miraculously live batteries, and the precious logbook and map, which I wrapped in an oilcloth bag. The brass key I put on a string around my neck, a cold, heavy promise against my skin. The journey to the grotto was not easy. The map was old, and the landscape had changed. I had to navigate by the contours of the hills, the curve of a creek, the position of a particular rock formation my great-grandfather had sketched. It was a 3-hour hike through dense, untamed forest. I felt a strange sense of connection to him, this quiet surveyor who had walked this same ground a century before me. I wasn't just following a map, I was retracing his steps. Finally, I heard it. A low, steady roar that grew louder as I approached. And then I saw it. A cascade of water tumbling over a sheer rock face into a clear, cold pool below. The waterfall. Just as Clara had written. My heart pounded. I scrambled over slick, moss-covered rocks, the spray misting my face, until I was standing directly behind the curtain of water. And there it was, a dark opening in the rock, almost perfectly concealed. The entrance to the cave. It was smaller than I imagined, a narrow fissure I had to squeeze through sideways. Inside, the air was cool and still, and smelled of damp stone and rich earth. I switched on my flashlight, its beam cutting a bright circle in the absolute darkness. The cave was not large, more of a deep, hollowed-out chamber, and in the center of the chamber, sitting on a flat-topped rock as if it were an altar, was a second metal box. It was identical to the first, only this one was free of dust, its black paint still dark and unmarred. The brass key slid into the lock as if it were made of butter. With a soft click, it turned. I lifted the lid. My flashlight beam fell upon the contents, and I gasped. It was filled with cash. Neat, tight bundles of it, old bills mostly, wrapped in paper bands. But that wasn't all. Beneath the money were more documents. Deeds, mineral rights surveys, and a thick envelope with Ms. Chen's name written on it in my grandmother's hand. Inside that envelope was a letter, and a detailed accounting of Richard's finances. Accounts he thought were secret, shell corporations, a history of shady deals going back 20 years. Clara hadn't just been suspicious, she had been investigating. She had hired a private detective. She had been building a case against him for 2 decades, just in case. This wasn't just a lifeboat anymore. This was a battleship. I sat there on the cold stone floor of the cave, surrounded by my inheritance, and I felt a power course through me that was dizzying. It wasn't the money. It was the knowledge. It was the truth. It was the realization that I was not a victim. I was the granddaughter of Clara May Thompson, and my war was just beginning. If you have ever had to face a truth that changed everything you thought you knew about your life, you know this feeling. It's terrifying, but it's also liberating. It's the moment you stop being a passenger and grab the wheel. If this story is speaking to you, if you're finding a piece of your own journey in mine, this isn't just about my story. It's about the strength we find when we're pushed to the edge. Your story matters. Let's get back to what happened next. The walk back to the cabin was different. I was no longer a refugee seeking shelter. I was a general returning to her command post. Every step was firm, every breath was steady. The forest didn't seem menacing anymore. It felt like an ally. The cabin, when it came into view, didn't look dilapidated. It looked like headquarters. My first act was to build up the fire until it was a roaring inferno, a beacon against the encroaching night. My second was to make a plan. I spread the map, the logbook, and the contents of the second box across the big oak table. The sheer, breathtaking scope of my grandmother's foresight was laid bare in the flickering firelight. She hadn't just left me money. She had left me a strategy. The mineral rights surveys were the first surprise. My great-grandfather, in his quiet wanderings, hadn't just claimed worthless land. He had claimed land that the geologists of his day had overlooked. According to the surveys Clara had commissioned in the 80s, several of his rock garden plots sat on top of significant quartz and, in one case, a rare granite deposit. Worthless land. The file on Richard was the second, more brutal revelation. It was a meticulous chronicle of his greed. Small-scale embezzlement at his first job. A partnership that ended with his partner mysteriously bankrupt. A pattern of leveraging and liquidating, of taking on debt in other people's names. My own story was just the final chapter in a long, sordid book. The private investigators' reports were dry, factual, and utterly damning. Clara had known everything. She had watched him, tracked him, and prepared for the day he would finally turn on me. Why hadn't she told me? The question burned in my mind. But as I sat there, in her chair, in her home, I began to understand. To tell me would have been to force my hand. She would have been the one destroying my life, my marriage. She knew I had to come to the truth on my own. She knew I had to choose to leave, to choose to fight. So instead of giving me a warning, she gave me armor and a sword, and trusted that I would know when and how to use them. The choice she had laid out in her letter was clear. I could take the cash. It was more than enough to live comfortably for the rest of my life, and just disappear. Let Richard face whatever karma came for him. Let the land sit forgotten for another generation. Or I could stay. I could use the evidence Clara had gathered. I could use the leverage of the mineral rights. I could reclaim not just my financial security, but my name, my story. There in the quiet of the cabin, with the ghosts of my ancestors all around me, it wasn't a choice at all. Running would be an insult to Clara's memory. It would be an insult to the quiet surveyor who collected scraps of the world. It would be an insult to myself. I picked up the thick envelope with Ms. Chen's name on it. My war chest wasn't just the money. It was the truth. The next morning, I walked the 2 miles into the town of Blackwood. It was a small, sturdy-looking town, the kind with a main street and not much else. I found a payphone outside the general store, a relic from another time that suddenly felt like the most secure technology on Earth. I called Ms. Chen's office, feeding the phone a steady diet of quarters from a roll I'd found in the lockbox. "Eleanor, are you all right? Where are you?" Her voice was tight with professional concern. "I'm fine, Ms. Chen," I said, and I was surprised by the steadiness of my own voice. It sounded different, lower, more resonant. "I'm more than fine. I'm at my grandmother's cabin. I've found some things. Things that changed the situation." "Change it how?" "I have my grandmother's original deeds to over a dozen parcels of land in this county. I have geological surveys, and I have a complete dossier on Richard Vance's financial activities compiled by a private investigator going back 20 years. There was a stunned silence on the other end of the line. I could picture her in her beige office, her professional calm completely shattered. "Eleanor, what are you saying?" "I'm saying Richard didn't just leave me penniless. He committed fraud. And I believe I have the proof. I also believe I am the sole owner of mineral rights that a certain development company, which I see from these papers has been trying to acquire land from the state park, would be very interested in." The silence stretched longer. Finally, Ms. Chen spoke, and her voice was completely different. The sympathetic tone was gone, replaced by the sharp, focused voice of a shark that has just scented blood in the water. "Don't move, Eleanor. Don't talk to anyone. I'm getting in my car. I'll be there in 4 hours." After the call, I went into the general store. A bell chimed above the door. An old man with a magnificent white beard sat behind the counter, reading a newspaper. He looked up over his spectacles. "Help you?" "I need some supplies," I said. "Work gloves, a shovel, some nails, and coffee. Real coffee." He nodded slowly. "Fixing up the old Thompson place, are you? Haven't seen anyone up there in years. Good to see it getting some life back." "I'm planning on staying a while," I said. The words felt solid, real, as I said them. I spent the next 4 hours working. I wasn't waiting. I was preparing. I cleared the deadfall from the path. I hammered the crooked shutter back into place. I dug out the old vegetable garden plot, the soil rich and dark under the blanket of weeds. Each swing of the shovel, each nail driven home, was an affirmation. I wasn't just fixing a cabin. I was rebuilding my life. I was putting down roots in the soil my great-grandfather had claimed, in the sanctuary my grandmother had protected. When Ms. Chen's sleek, expensive car finally pulled up, she found me not huddled and waiting, but covered in dirt, my hair tied back, my hands raw, and a pile of freshly split firewood stacked neatly on the porch. She stepped out of her car, her city shoes looking absurdly out of place, and stared at me. The woman she saw was not the broken, numb client who had sat in her office 2 days ago. This was someone else entirely. This was Clara's granddaughter. The weeks that followed were a strange mixture of quiet, physical labor and distant, strategic warfare. Ms. Chen took the dossier and the deeds back to the city, and a slow, complex legal machine ground into motion. There were phone calls, hushed and urgent. Words like leverage and federal charges and asset seizure became part of my vocabulary. But most of that was a world away. My world was the cabin. I woke with the sun and worked until my muscles ached. I replaced the rotten porch steps with new wood I had delivered from the town sawmill. I reglazed the old windows, carefully scraping away the cracked putty and replacing it. I scrubbed the stone hearth until it was clean, and I painted the interior walls a warm, creamy white that made the firelight glow. The work was hard, honest, and deeply satisfying. Every improvement was a victory, a reclamation. One afternoon, the man from the general store, whose name I learned was Hank, drove up in his pickup truck. He didn't say much. He just unloaded a wheelbarrow, a set of post-hole diggers, and a small box of vegetable seedlings. "Figured you could use these," he grunted. "That garden's got good sun." It was a simple gesture, but it felt enormous. It was the first thread of a new community being woven around me. I didn't hear from Richard. I didn't expect to. According to Ms. Chen, he had been located. His offshore paradise had been frozen. He was, to use her term, contained. I tried to picture him, trapped and furious, his careful plans unraveling because of a worthless pile of sticks, and the quiet, persistent love of a woman he'd met twice. I felt a grim satisfaction, but not joy. My focus wasn't on his ruin. It was on my own reconstruction. One crisp autumn evening, I was sitting on my new porch steps, watching the sun set through the pine trees when Ms. Chen called. Her voice was calm, but I could hear the triumph beneath it. "It's done, Eleanor," she said. "The development company was very motivated to acquire the mineral rights to your parcels, especially the granite deposit. They were also very motivated to avoid a public scandal involving state park land. They made a generous offer. Very generous." She named a figure that made my head spin. It was more money than I could have imagined. "And Richard?" I asked. "Faced with federal fraud charges and the evidence your grandmother collected, he agreed to a settlement. All remaining marital assets are yours. All debts are his. He has waived any and all future claims. He's left with nothing, Eleanor. Exactly what he left you with." I was quiet for a long moment, listening to the wind in the trees. I had won. Clara had won. But it didn't feel like the explosive victory I might have imagined. It was quiet. It was solid. It was the feeling of a foundation settling firmly into the earth. "Eleanor?" Ms. Chen asked. "Are you there?" "I'm here," I said. "Thank you, Ms. Chen, for everything." "You did the work, Eleanor," she said, and for the first time, I heard real warmth in her voice. "You just needed the tools." After I hung up, I didn't move. I just sat there as the sky turned from orange to deep violet and the first stars appeared. The money was a good thing. It meant security. It meant I could restore the cabin properly, maybe even help Hank fix the roof on the general store. But it wasn't the prize. The prize was this: the cool, clean air in my lungs, the solid wood of the steps beneath me, the quiet strength I felt in my own bones. The prize was knowing that I was not the woman who had walked into that beige office. I was a woman who knew how to build a fire, how to read a map, how to start again. I was home. Winter came to the mountains, blanketing the world in a deep, cleansing white. The legal battles were over. The money was in a trust managed by a ferociously protective Ms. Chen. And Richard? Well, Richard was just a ghost, a cautionary tale. My life narrowed to the simple, satisfying rhythms of the cabin. chopping wood, tending the fire, reading the books on Clara's shelves, and watching the snow fall. The silence wasn't empty, it was full. It was full of the presence of my grandmother, of the pride of my great-grandfather. It was full of my own newfound peace. I learned the patterns of the winter birds, the tracks of the deer that came to the edge of the clearing. I was no longer an observer of nature. I felt like a part of it. I had thought, for 41 years, that home was a place you shared, a place defined by another person. I thought home was a beautiful house in the suburbs, a two-car garage, a life that looked perfect from the outside. I had been wrong. Home wasn't a place another person could give you or take away from you. It wasn't something that could be mortgaged or liquidated. Home was a quiet, unshakable thing you built inside yourself. It was the strength to face the storm, the wisdom to find the hidden path, the courage to rebuild from the ashes. My grandmother hadn't just left me a cabin and some money. She had left me the blueprint for my own soul. I look out my window now, at the snow-covered pines, and I think about the woman I was. The scared, numb, broken woman who thought her life was over. I wish I could go back and tell her that this was not an ending. It was a beginning. That betrayal would be the catalyst for her own becoming. That being left with nothing would be the gift that allowed her to find everything. This story, the one I'm telling you now, isn't really about a bad husband or a hidden inheritance. It's about the foundations we build our lives on. For so long, I built mine on the shifting sands of another person's approval. Now, I'm building it on the bedrock of my own strength. A bedrock that was there all along, buried deep beneath the surface. My grandmother knew it was there. She just had to trust that I would be willing to dig. If you have made it this far, thank you. Thank you for sitting with me, for listening not just with your ears, but with your heart. My story is my own, but I know that the themes of loss, of resilience, of finding your way back to yourself are universal. We all have a cabin somewhere inside us, a place of strength we may have forgotten about. I start with the quiet, incredible strength of ordinary people who have been through extraordinary things. If that's a scribe, and I want you to do one more thing for me. In them you found strength you didn't know you had. It doesn't have to be a big, dramatic story. It can be a small moment of choosing to go on, of taking one more step. I will read every single one. Because in sharing our stories, we remind each other that we are not alone. And we remind each other that no matter how deep the winter, spring always